So we'll now start the webinar series on basic concepts that are here to help you offer spiritual companionship to adult survivors of child sexual abuse. This session is about the lasting impact of abuse on adults. I would like to preface the session with the point that although the lasting impact is what we struggle with as we enter our recovery process, these things and these wounds are not unchanged, and as we work with our therapist and others, we can overcome and move toward well-being. This session covers the impact of abuse on the adult. That is, what is the lasting impact of having been sexually abused as a child, and how does this impact affect one's faith life? By way of reminder, I'm qualified in a certain way to make this presentation because I was the survivor of abuse by clergy from being about age 7 until 19. Currently, I am devoted to helping people integrate their faith in Christ with their mix of recovery, support, and programs, and also to use Christ and grace in their healing process to help reconcile with their own past, within their relationships, both past and present, and certainly with God, and possibly with the I work from the concept of this trajectory of hope, and let's look at that in connection with the impact on one's life. First, there is the abuse, but then there's the lasting effect of the abuse. That impact lasts long after the incident's end. The cringe of pain, it can continue far into adult life until care is administered to the wound. Quite distinctly, another way to look at it is this: victimhood is often a lasting mindset, simply because it's how we experienced life before we knew life could be any different. And then we become survivors. And suddenly, we find ourselves with options. Recovery can begin, but will it? At some point, most, not all of us, come face to face with what happened in the past. Most, but not all of us, have been running away from it, anesthetizing it, hiding from it. Sometimes it takes a crisis to get us there. Sometimes it just happens. We thought we got past the horror, the pain, the trauma, only to find out we didn't. So we're usually pretty shocked at this point, and that's when recovery begins. The process is messy and painful. It can disrupt life's routines and relationships. It does pass if we keep at it. Trust me, I've been there. What happens after recovery varies person to person. Some survivors I know have gotten to a point when it's as if the past is gone and all its powers are removed. Most survivors I know, including myself, enjoy some of that sometimes. We have all integrated the memories into our current lives in order to move on as well whole beings. We all have learned to manage that lasting impact. What challenges remain will vary widely person to person. All of it takes time. My recovery kicked off in 1984, and it's still continuing. So when we talk about the impact of having been abused as a child, I would like to cover just these topics briefly. 5 basic facts you ought to know. 5 top lies that we emerge from our childhood believing that have a great effect on our faith. The range of the impact, the extent over time of the impact, the nuances to this impact, outcome, and certainly hope. The basic facts here are 5. According to the American Psychological Association, 300,000 children are abused sexually every year. According to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, 1 in 6 boys, 1 in 4 girls are abused by the time they reach 18. 30% of abusers are adult family members. 60% aren't family members, but they're known to the child. Anything from family friend to teacher, coach, pediatrician, neighbor, or clergy. 10% are strangers. That 10% is hard to estimate in a sense, because as the internet plays a greater role in predators grooming children, while they would count as strangers, they make themselves very well known and familiar to the child over social media. Now let's talk about the 5 lies. One of the most difficult lies, and this is where you can start seeing the evil at work, is that you teach a child, I learned that to surrender was to be annihilated. Defiance becomes a response that keeps one safe. That's topsy-turvy with a life of healthy faith, where to surrender to God is to become not annihilated, but fulfilled, to have our human nature brought up to the divine. And to be defiant is to actually keep oneself from that fulfillment. It takes a lot in one's faith life to work that through and to feel safe enough to surrender. Another lie is that caring is the same as grooming a victim. Predators groom, they take their time. It's part of their, essentially, thrill, where they take a child who's hesitant and maybe even vulnerable and timid and make all of their objections to objectionable behavior melt away by incrementally desensitizing them to an ability to object by caring. And it all looks like caring. So when you come out of childhood and you've had very little, by contrast, to this overwhelming experience of being harmed, it's very hard to see caring as anything as but having a. Another lie that we often share is to forgive is to enable. Sadly, that's a lie that was taught to us by the church and the hierarchy, and also continued to be long after we became adults. Sadly, bishops confused forgiving with enabling predators. A 4th lie is that authority itself is predatory. Predators are authority over children. That's why we believe them as they groom us, that no, this isn't bad and that's not bad. It also tells those who have been abused by clergy that which is sacred serves this authority. And the last is that lies are words are lies. Grooming has taught us, everybody believing that this wonderful adult is wonderful, when in fact they're hurting us, scaring us, frightening us. The world is opposite to what we experience it. What people say is opposite to what they do. Things become very confusing. And with these 5 lies is our reality. It's a very confusing world and a very dangerous world. The range of the impact is very great. It's not just on this one individual. The original family, based on the secrecy and the hurt and all of the different roles that play out in the dynamics that allow for abuse to happen, the original family is at least harmed, sometimes decimated. The family that we grow up and have as adults, our primary family, shudders and bears the wounds that we bring with us, unhealed, if we do, into those family relationships. And beyond the original and primary families, there are the extended families, for example, that live near each other, whose children also probably suffer from the same predator. There are our friends as children, and there are our friends as adults, all of whom suffer not having full access to us as we remain guarded and hidden within ourselves, for example. And there are the parishes and the small town communities and the larger communities, the church, that are harmed by these broken relationships. And then there is the vicarious wounding, the experience where people who reach out to help us, people who want to help us, become harmed themselves because they are not armed, they are not prepared to deal with the evil in our stories. And that's in part why some of these presentations are given to you. The impact can be very, very long term, and it can go very, very deep. Some of us use all sorts of substances to numb. Some of us will self-abuse, will cut, will seek to harm ourselves and pick up where the abusers left off. Most of us experience and would recount experience being abused as a kind of death. A suicide is just completing that action, and it certainly ends the pain. We find toxic people in dangerous settings. Why? Because we don't know any different. Because that's what feels like the norm. And to choose healthy relationships takes a long time. Some of us really cleverly dealt with the enormous psychic pressure of being a child isolated by an abuser, by all sorts of mental reactions, by all sorts of disassociations, which later play out as mental illness. There are other mental illnesses, like just depression, that most of us have struggled with at certain points. These are perfectly natural reactions, yet something we have to deal with on a chronic basis, some of us, all our lives. And some of us expressed that agony with chronic physical illnesses and other types of illnesses that had direct relationship to the impact of abuse on a child. This long-term impact leads to a kind of isolation, but it also tells you something, if we're standing in front of you when we first meet you, about our tenaciousness. We didn't give up. It tells you something about the drive and our life force, that we didn't really, really succumb to the death that is abuse. It gives you hints to a creative energy within ourselves, which may or may not come out as writing or painting or music, but it certainly shows up as a creative person. And also what you'll find is a great deal of compassion and wisdom for people who are suffering, a great potential for being gentle, and far more often than anyone wants to really acknowledge, upstanding people have survived horrible backgrounds and still contribute as loving persons, regardless of how hobbled we may be. This all spells something called resilience that psychologists don't understand. They study it right and left. They don't know really why one person is more or less, but they do know survivors all share something of resilience among them. And that's something to really celebrate. The nuances, however, of this pain, of the impact, go into all of our senses, in a sense that our past and our present have a very difficult time coexisting until in therapy we're able to integrate them. In a way, it makes life kind of like the game Chutes and Ladders. So in your adulthood, you might be close to the end of the game, but then you'll smell something, or you'll hear something, or you'll see something that reminds you, before you're even consciously aware of being abused. And all of a sudden, you're feeling not the feelings associated with your day, but the feelings associated with 10, 20, 30 years ago. And all of a sudden you're feeling as if you were a child. Feelings you almost couldn't feel then because you were so unsafe. There was so much danger and there were so many terrifying things going on. So in a way, it's really important to understand as you go forward, you don't want to re-victimize survivors by creating situations, emotions, by triggering memories, by having things present that could make them be triggered to the past. For people who were abused within the church, this means you may not be able to meet with this person in a church or on a church property. But the beauty is that while we go into therapy seeking to restore our lives, most commonly, to restore what we lost, what we end up doing in therapy is grieving that we can't. We can't gain the life that was taken from us, but we can have the life that we have now. On the one hand, we will have those wounds. They will be with us. They will be integrated. We will come to see them as something that also made us amazing friends, that gave us a capacity for love and gentility, wisdom that many people don't have, but we will still be wounded. And what's important, and what I deal with often, is just reminding people that the image of Christ, he wasn't restored in the resurrection to a body without wounds. Those wounds were resurrected in testimony and giving glory. And in that sense, we really do become wounded healers. And it's not as if we have to graduate to the point where we're thriving before we help heal others. We can still be survivors and we can still be victims. But what we can use what happened to us as a gift to ourselves. That's why your first response really needs to be very, very simple. You need to be very careful, and I will go over this in the future sessions, about not being too complicated. You get to be human with this person and express your sorrow and your apology for what they went through. The most important thing you can say to somebody is to remind them that it's not their fault and that they are loved by God. And this is the setting of faith, where these words can have very great power. That completes our review of the lasting impact of child sexual abuse on adults. And now we'll talk about first encounters you're likely to have with people in various settings. And thanks very much. For other resources, you can go to the website, teresagreen.org. You can check out YouTube channel, Restoring Sanctuary. Or you can look up either of my books, Restoring Sanctuary, or the book I co-authored with Father Fiorelli. And of course, as always, if you have suggestions, requests, complaints, or criticisms, feel free to send them to me. Thank you again, and God bless us, one and all.